Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
People don't normally have trouble hearing me, I have to say, but I'm just going to check to make absolutely sure. Before I start, what I was actually planning on saying, I want to say that whenever I do a service like this, when it's kind of collaborative and you've had lots of different people involved, and while you've talked about the general topic and you've got an idea of what's going on, you don't necessarily know exactly what the other person is going to say or play or whatever else. So David didn't know when he did that psalm reading earlier that a few years ago, or probably quite a few years ago now, I had a prayer published in a book of prayers, which were all about prayers to do with depression and mental health issues. And my prayer was always on Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills from where will my help come. To be honest, I'd completely forgotten that until David shared that prayer. And I was like, oh, yes! I'd forgotten all about that. I never thought about it. I dug it out and brought it with me. However, you just kind of imagine what it was like. So, I want to start off this evening by saying, before we get into the topic of Jesus and mental health, I want to start by saying I'm not a mental health professional. So I don't have a specific qualification in mental health. I mean, I do have like mental health first aid training and stuff like that, but I'm not a mental health like psychologist or mental health nurse or anything along those lines. I'm not an expert in mental health. I'm also, I have to say, not an expert in Jesus either. Who is? So what I want to say is that very much my reflections for this evening are based on my own personal lived experience of living with a chronic mental health issue and what I found helpful and how that's informed my faith. So I just want to give you that warning so you don't go away going, here is the gospel truth, well I think you're going to do that. But just so you know, I am not a mental health professional. So I thought we'd start by having a look at some Bible verses where Jesus talks specifically about mental health. And having done that, I'm now going to talk about what I was actually planning, because there isn't anything specific. If you look in the Bible, you can find verses where it's clearly alluding to something along those lines, or where it's spoken about somebody maybe having a demon, which is often kind of interpreted by people as being used for a language that they didn't have, for use for mental health issues. And I'm not going to touch on all of that this evening, but there aren't any specific issues where Jesus says, listen up, all those who have depression and anxiety, this one is for you. Listen up, all those who take however many SSRIs a day, this one is for you. There's nothing like that in the Bible, but there are quite a few verses that I find really helpful and encouraging. So that's what I'm going to look at in a little bit. But I thought I'd start off not with the verses about Jesus, because like I've said, there aren't any, but with just a little bit of a backstory about me and my own experience and my lived experience of mental health. So, for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Melissa, which we've said already, and I work full-time for the Methodist Church, and I have done for 22, 23 years, something along those lines, in various different places and in various different capacities, but almost always with some sort of pastoral care for a church or churches. Recently, my job has changed. I now do development work around buildings in churches, but I still work full-time for Methodist Church. I'm a Methodist local preacher, so I've been preaching in churches on Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings for about 20 odd years. All of that time, I've also been living with these mental health issues. So ever since I was around, 5, 6, so definitely younger than my daughter Martha's age, but potentially around about Isabel's age, I have been living with OCD, which is an acronym, is that the right word? Yeah. For obsessive compulsive disorder. I wasn't diagnosed with it at age 5 or 6. But that's when it first started to become a problem for me. I remember being very small and my mum buying me some really disgusting, horrible smelling hand like lotion to put on my hands because I'd washed them so much that they were cracked and bleeding, even as quite a small child. So my experience with my OCD, the way that it's tended to work for me has been around fears and concerns around contamination and touching things and things being, and I'm going to use the inverted commas, dirty. In reality, even though I'm worrying about it, I technically, as a person with a science degree, know that it's not really, but that doesn't stop the worry. And it was always a concern about contamination, about the different things I've touched, and what might then feel worried about where I then touch afterwards. Now, I was looking up online for an example of an advert to show you, which was one from probably my late teens and early 20s. I think it was for Dettol. And it was about a woman doing, it was a woman, sorry, but it was a woman cleaning in her kitchen, and she picked up a piece of raw chicken, and then she placed it back in the food hygiene guy absolutely knows what I'm talking about. And then she put it back in the tray, but didn't then wash her hands. And then everything she subsequently touched afterwards becomes green and stained with these germs. So she touches the counter and then gets green and marked. And then she touches the cloth that she's cleaning the counter with, and then the buttons on the oven and the light switch. And then her daughter comes in and shows her her art picture. She holds that, and then she gives the daughter a kiss on the head and holds her outside of the head. And the daughter, and in the end, by the end of the advert, it's like there's more green than not from this kind of picture of where this bacteria is going around the kitchen. I searched and searched on YouTube, I could not find it. Clearly, it's not a classic. But what can you do? So that is how it works in my head. That is what my brain does. That is how my mind looks like all of the time. So to give you an example of that, before I came up to talk just now, I was sat in my chair, and I'm going, right, I could really do with having a lectern in front of me. Even if I don't particularly need to look at what I'm looking at in front of me, there's something very safe and comforting about a lectern, or indeed just something there that you could grip onto if you're really struggling. So despite having preached for 20 years, I still do quite like the kind of, I've got something solid here for me. But I'm looking at the lectern going, okay. See, the way my mind works is anything in my house is clean. Anything that I bring into my house gets wiped and sanitized. Cats don't like it. No, I don't really kids don't like that. Anything that brings into my house gets wiped and is all sanitized. Anything outside of my house is inherently dirty, right? So I'm looking at the lectern going, okay, I need a lectern, it's over there. I'm going to have to touch it and pick it up and bring it over here. I suppose I could ask somebody for me, and David did very kindly offer. But I was like, I've already thought it through in my head with a plan. So I pick the lectern up, and then I move the microphone, because if I'm holding the microphone, and that's another thing I've got to worry about, because somebody else has been holding it, somebody else has been touching it, my mind is then thinking about that all of the time, rather than concentrating on what I'm saying. So I'm like, if I put the microphone here, I won't have to hold it, so that won't be worrying me. I'll bring the lectern over, and then I'll go straight back over and gel my hands with my special gel over in my bag, because then I'll feel okay about coming and standing here at the front. And I kind of feel okay touching this bit, so I think probably nobody's touched it for a little while, so I probably feel all right about that. So I'm kind of working all of that out in my head during the first hit before I even come up to the front. And then I'm thinking about, well, I've touched the can, and something else has touched that, I'll have to gel my hands for that as well. And that is what it's like living in my head all of the time. It doesn't switch off. It doesn't stop. There isn't a point at which I kind of dial that down and that isn't happening. It's always the case. And it has been since I was 5 or 6. And my parents at first, when they saw me washing my hands more than I really needed to, just thought it was some sort of kind of phase that I'd get over, I guess. And we're much better now at talking about mental health and about other similar things. But, you know, it was the 80s. And they really just hadn't heard much about anything along those lines at all. And they just thought it was something I would eventually grow out of. Which I'm still waiting for, and potentially that will happen, I suppose. But I suspect it's probably not going to at this point, because I'm now 45. But they thought, oh, I'd grow out of it, it would get better. And sometimes it was worse, and sometimes it was better. The more stressed I was, the worse it would get. Doing my GCSEs, that was a particularly fun time. But what was even worse was after my GCSEs, because, at least then I had the exams to worry about. When I finished my GCSEs, I'm at home on my own, because you finish a bit early, everybody else is still still at school, my sisters were still at school. That part, I could rub that in their faces, that was great. But being at home on my own suddenly, that gives you time to think, right? That gives your brain time to work on all the things that you worry about. And so, whereas I had exams and school and all of those other things to think about and worry about before, I was at home. I had nothing else to worry about. That was quite worrying in and of itself. But it meant that my OCD worked over time, and it got to the point where I couldn't leave the house on my own because I wouldn't be absolutely convinced that I had turned the cooker off, or that I had turned off the lights, or that I'd locked the front door, or that I'd locked the garage, or countless other things. And it got to the point where, I'd walk out of my house and I'd think, I'll go into town, I'll catch the bus, and then I'd have to go back and check, and then I'd have to go back and check again. And I once famously walked into the village my parents lived in, which is almost a mile from my parents' house, and stood at the bus stop going, but I can't quite convince myself. I can't convince myself that I turned the oven off. I'm going to have to go back and use the oven. My mother had probably used it the night before, but I hadn't touched it. But in my mind, it was something I had to check. And it got to the point where I couldn't go out of the house without somebody else going with me who could check with me and could therefore verify for me that, what I thought was turned off really, really, really was turned off. And when I turned my back, it hadn't somehow managed to turn itself back on again, which I guess is kind of the logic or the lack of logic that my brain worked with. And then when I was about 16, 17, I was sitting reading a magazine. My dad used to get a Sunday paper, and I was allergic to paper, but they always came with those nice glossy magazines. And I used to quite enjoy reading the glossy magazines. And one day I was reading an article in the glossy magazine, which was all about a guy who bought a nuclear bomb shelter and turned it into a house. That was fascinating, that's not what I want to talk about. Following on article, but I just remember it because it really stuck in my mind because of the following article, which was all about a woman who had been recently diagnosed with OCD. And she talked about it in this article, and about how it ruled her life, and about how she worried about contamination and washing her hands, about how many times she had to go back to turn the oven on and off, how many times she had to flick the light switches, how many times she had to lock the door. And I sat there reading this going, it's not just me. I thought I was the really weirdest person in the whole world and nobody else had ever experienced this before, but it's not just me. There's a name for this. It was like clicking things into place. Scales falling from eyes. That sense of going, I'm not on my own. I still wasn't diagnosed with it until I was nearly 30, I think, which is the first time I found professional help, because it had got to the point where it was controlling every part of my working life, and everything I touched in my work, and I lived where I worked in a flat above my church, was contaminated. So, I'd go in the lift, that was a problem. I'd go in the office, that was a problem. I'd have to count the money from the little charity shop we had at church, that was a big problem. And it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, till I got to the point where I was spending more time washing my hands than I was doing my actual work. And my boss was like, I think you might need to go to the doctor. So I did, and I spoke to somebody, and I had some counselling at the Maudsley Hospital, which is a very big mental health hospital in London, which does some amazing, amazing work with mental health issues. And that made a huge difference. And I was, it's still there, it was still kind of living in the background. I was always going to have those thoughts, but I was capable of kind of coping in my day-to-day life. But you know what's absolutely going to completely stymie your thoughts, like nothing else ever will, is something having a pandemic, where you're told you mustn't touch other things that other people have touched, right? And it was like, I'm watching the news, and I'm watching Chris Whitty standing in front of his lectern with his slides saying all this, and I'm going, I knew it, I told you we shouldn't be touching this thing, I knew it all along, I was right. Why don't people listen? This is just proof that this is the way it should be all along. I didn't quite say that, but that was kind of what was going through my head. And all the time when I've been able to kind of maybe convince myself that maybe I didn't have to worry about this or didn't have to worry about that, you've got the chief medical professional standing on the podium him telling you about this, do you know what? You kind of go, okay, well, maybe I really do have to worry about this. This is horrendous, and I really, really struggled, certainly at the very, very beginning of the pandemic. But do you know what? The other thing about that is that if you've been spending your entire life washing your hands and worrying about contamination, you are super hot at pandemics, right? You are absolutely on it, right? You can absolutely wipe all the shopping. I'm an expert. I can wipe every article of shopping, and I know whether I've covered every bit of that bottle, every bit of that washing up. Yeah, it's super wiped. I am there. I always have wipes with me. It's not being a mum. It's having OCD. That just kind of helps with that. I always have them with me. I always have the hand gel with me before the pandemic. They're saying on the BBC, people have to wash themselves their hands for 20 seconds, and I'm there going, well, what will I do with the rest of my time then? Because, were people only washing their hands for less than 20 seconds before this? What kind of germ-ridden world am I living in? Dear no, I thought it was bad. I didn't think it was that bad. What do I do now? Okay, at least I know everybody's washing their hands for 20 seconds. Well, that's a relief. I hope they still do that. Okay, but that frees up a lot of time for me. Great. But I did have to be very, very specific about the 20 seconds, because if I hadn't been very specific about timing myself, and I still can't, I'd have been just still washing my hands today. Because otherwise I would never have got to the point where I felt that they were clean enough. So I struggled during the pandemic, and then actually it was really nice. I kind of miss it. I know that's not what most people think, but I kind of miss it because it was really safe. I was in my house. Remember, my house is my safe zone. My house it's not clean. I'd like to say it's clean, it's not. It's not contaminated. Those two things are very different. It's not tidy, it's not clean, but it's not contaminated, definitely. My house was my safe zone. I was in my house, I was safe. As long as we didn't interact with the big bad world, and we were told not to anyway, I was good, it was fine, And I was like, okay, I can live with this. This is all right. It would have been better without my ex-husband. Then apart from that, it was really good. And I was doing worship online. That worked really well. I didn't have to go to church and deal with all the things I normally have to deal with at church, like people wanting to shake my hand, which is totally great and totally fine. I absolutely respect that that's one thing that people do. If you're not good with contamination germs, it's really hard. Or people wanting to hug you during the piece. One of my churches that I used to have, they were real huggers. And I would be like, so feel like I know you well enough to be embracing me in this way. I'll just stand here kind of and just sort of vaguely put my hands here so that I'm not putting them anywhere that I shouldn't be, but also so that I feel like this is not okay. It was lovely not having to do that, and not having to think about that, and not having to worry about offending people about that. That, I thought, was absolutely brilliant. But it was also really stressful and really, really hard work. And then coming out of lockdown was even more stressful. And suddenly going back into churches and everybody being all gung-ho. Oh, gosh.
Well, I think
everybody suddenly being all gung-ho and throwing themselves at each other. And I was just like, oh my word. Everybody's touching stuff, and this is not okay. And I'd be preaching at the front, and people would be handing me things, and I'm going, and I've got that picture of that green, bacterial stuff all over my hands the minute they do it. And can I pick up those? No. Can I get them? No. Just don't touch anything. I will stand here. You will keep a distance, and I will do the service. But that got really stressful, and in the end, I stopped work for a little bit, and I had some time off. And in the end, I had about a year off, because once you stop, you suddenly realise how hard it's been when you've been doing all that stuff, and how much work you've been putting in to just kind of vaguely appearing normal. I don't think I've ever managed that, let's be fair. And that's got nothing to do with OCD, but that the work that I put into kind of masking that and hiding that and not letting that be affecting anybody else around me, my family, or the people who met me in churches, that takes up a huge amount of mental energy, and I stopped. And having stopped, I was like, whoa, that was a lot, actually. That was a lot. I had nearly a year where I was off work. During which, for the first time in my life, I got given some medication by the doctor. I got given an SSRI, which is something inhibitor. I can't remember what it stands for. But basically, it helps your brain produce the right amount of chemicals to balance it out a little bit. So I now have some quite high dose of those that I take every day. It still doesn't stop the worrying about contamination, but it dials it down enough that I can vaguely function in society. There you go. As much as I ever did before, anyway. So that's kind of where I'm at, and that's what I live with day to day, and that's my day-to-day experience. So everything that I do, every action that I make, every time I go out of my house, that is a thing that I talk about and I think about in my head, even down to the fact that we had a Tesco order delivered this afternoon, and we wiped every item of the 86 items that came in the shopping, because if we don't, even though technically I know that isn't a problem anymore and that isn't the same degree of risk, in my mind I'm still going to think about it and I'm still going to worry about it and I'm still going to track every item that came in that Tesco order around my house as I see that growing spread of green bacteria. But you know what else I found during the pandemic? Is that my experience and being honest with how I was doing and how I was feeling with my experience of my OCD and my mental health was hugely helpful to other people. So, at that point I was a church pastor and I had 3 churches that I had pastoral care of. So, I wasn't the minister, I wasn't allowed to wear the bit of plastic that magically does make you a minister, but to all intents and purposes I was the minister of that church, those 3 churches. And I would ring around my congregation members and ask them how they were getting on and talk to them about what was going on for them. And they would ask me, how are you? And I would be honest. And I would say, actually, it's really hard. And it's really hard for these reasons. And I would talk about the things that I was struggling with and about wiping down my shopping and contamination. And amazingly, what I found was that when I shared that stuff with other people, they would then share with me about the things that they were really struggling with as well. And particularly, there were several people, both within my congregations and others who then later got in contact with me, who were struggling with the exact same issue that I was. One member of my congregation said, I can finally tell you, I've never felt able to tell anybody other than my best friend that I have crippling OCD. I've been sectioned with it before, and I really struggle with it, and this pandemic is absolutely crippling me in my way of being able to do things. And she could explain how she felt about things that she needed to wipe, or things that she felt contaminated, or worries that she had. And I was like, oh yeah, no, I totally get that. And when I said that, I absolutely, 100% totally got what she meant, because it's how I would have been feeling as well. She eventually went into a mental health unit for a little bit in a hospital, which was really, really helpful for her. But being able to talk to somebody about that and being able to have somebody walking alongside her while that was going on made a real difference. I had another lady who had a similar issue who was talking about going out as a church pastoral visitor and going and sort of doing distanced visits on the doorstep for people, but still having these thoughts in her mind going, but what if I take this contamination back home to my loved ones? What if I inadvertently cause the death of somebody else that I meet? And being able to talk to her about her fears with her OCD were really helpful as well. During the time that I have been struggling with my OCD and mental health, and that tends to come along with a bit of depression and other things of a similar type as well. One of the other things that I experienced was self-harm. So, when you know that there's this stuff going on in your head, and it really hurts and it's really hard, but you kind of can't really find the words to explain it, or if you can, people don't really get what you're saying, because unless you've lived it, you don't really get it. The way that I found was really helpful, not necessarily sensible, but helpful, was doing something to my arms in a destructive nature, because that meant that the amount that I felt on the inside was visible somehow, and it kind of made me real. That's not something that I do anymore, or haven't done for a while, which is really cool. I'm really grateful for. But it's something that once you've kind of done once, it's like you've opened that door, so it's always there. It's always a possibility. It's always an option for when things are getting stressful. It's still the first thought I have when I'm getting stressed. But the fact that I've experienced that as well meant that I could also talk to other people whose young people during COVID and during the pandemic were really struggling with their mental health. For one of my church members whose daughter had been self-harming for a while and then had attempted suicide, who had then been in hospital and stuff, the fact that I had hands-on first-degree knowledge of that and could talk to them about it and was honest about, what I'd experienced and also, where it was coming from for me and not just about it as a sort of that's not a very good way to cope, but talking about, why it was a good coping mechanism for me and why it had helped me. Being able to talk about that with people from an experience point of view meant that people were able to be really honest and open up with me. And the more I talk honestly about my mental health, in really lots of different ways, the more I find that people are free and able to share with me as well. And one of the things that I've really adopted, I think, since I've been back at work, which is about 18 months now, is just kind of saying it exactly like it is and what I need. So, I'll turn up and people will be like, can I make you a cup of tea? Now I will say yes, but certainly at the beginning I would go, no thank you, because I can't cope with the idea of you touching the tea bag, and I can't cope with the idea of you touching the cup, and I can't cope with the idea of this, and this, so can I go and make my own cup of tea? Or people will say, have one lady who wanted to give me a hug when I did a funeral, and I was like, I really cannot cope with that, please don't hug me. I wish you absolutely well, I kind of a virtual hug to you, but I need to be hands off. I'm really sorry, but that is just not something that I'm able to cope with. And now I'm just really upfront with it, I just say it, because actually that enables other people to be able to say what they feel about and what they need as well. So I've found that in being honest with it and being open about it, it sets you free, I think, is very much my experience. And I want to just look at a couple of Bible verses that sort of echo that and echo the experience that I've had. And the number one verse that I wanted to read for you is from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, which is Paul talking about the thorn in his side. So Paul says, even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. Because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I'm going to say that bit again. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And that, for me, is the message from the Bible about all sorts of different mental health issues. It's that we are called to be Christians, we are called to be followers of Jesus exactly as we are, not despite the various things that we might think of as thorns in our flesh, but because of them, because of the things that make us uniquely ourselves, and because of the things that we are able to share from ourselves with others. So I no longer think of my OCD and my experience with depression and self-harm as being, things that I've had to struggle through. And I certainly, sorry Paul, but I certainly don't think of them as being messengers from Satan to torment me. I prefer, if I had to choose, not to have to live with that day to day. But I also kind of think of it as a bit of a superpower. Like, it's something that I can bring into a pastoral care situation that somebody who hasn't experienced that can't. And I think that's true for all different aspects of mental health. If you've experienced that and are able to then bring it into a pastoral care situation, it then becomes something where you can share your experience and can share how Jesus has made a difference for you in that. I want to finish up by reading for you Matthew 5, verse 3, which is one of the verses from within the Beatitudes, which says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. But I've seen that translated in a Message version, because it says, blessed are, which says something along the lines of, because I didn't think to bring it with me, something along the lines of, blessed are you when you struggle, because when there is less of you, there is more of God. And I think that is my message for you to take away about living with mental health issues and with Jesus. It's that surrender of yourself and control of all the different things that we can't possibly control, and letting go and letting God. And that's certainly one of the things that I have learned from my experience. So a reminder that when we are weak, we are strong, and that when we let go, there is more of God in what we do.